This episode of the podcast is sponsored by Elchanan Schwartz Counseling. Elchanan Schwartz is a licensed mental health counselor with offices in Brooklyn and Lakewood, specializing in adults with anxiety and adjustment disorders, including stress related to challenging life circumstances such as chronic medical illness and grief. For an appointment, call 732-503-9158. If anyone would like to sponsor an episode or to support the show, or for any questions, comments, or feedback, please email sfarimchatter@gmail.com and also check out the website sfarimchatter.com. Hi everyone, welcome to another edition of the Tzafrir Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Dr. Tzafrir Barzilay, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Haifa Center of Mediterranean History at Haifa University, and who is the author of the recently published book called Poisoned Wells, Accusations, Persecution, and Minorities in Medieval Europe, 1321 to 1422, published by Penn University Press. And we'll be discussing this book and how it relates to the Black Death and accusations against Jews and other minorities. So thank you, Dr. Barzilay, for joining me.
Thank you for having me. Good evening.
So let's start off. Tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
So I started my way at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem at the Department of General History. And I did my PhD at Columbia University with Professor Adam Costo and Professor Elisheva Karlebach. And I didn't start as a Jewish historian. I started as a general historian or historian of medieval Europe. And the more I got into the field, the more I understood that looking at Jews more carefully can allow me to see all kinds of deeper layers of general society. When you look at the dynamic between minorities and the majority, Jews being one of the minorities of medieval society, you can understand many of the social phenomena that are going on. And since I finished my PhD in 2016, I came back to Israel. I spent some time at the Hebrew University again, and then at Ben Gurion University in Beersheba, and now I'm at Haifa, as you said. And over the past 6 years, my work, I think, has become more and more close to Jewish history, but I'm always with one foot in the general history and in another foot in the Jewish history. And I think that's the way to do it. You can't understand when you're looking at a minority inside a society, you cannot understand the minority without understanding the general society. And it really helps to understand the general society if you understand what's going on with the minorities.
Okay, now your work focuses on a medieval period, medieval history, medieval Jewish history, and like you said, also general history, and then specifically on the Black Death. I mean, how is this something that you got interested in this particular type of history?
So the Black Death is, I think, especially after the last 2 years, people can really understand that you can really study societies in times of crisis. All kinds of phenomena that are usually hidden when things are calm are suddenly come to light when there is a crisis. And the Black Death was a major crisis. We've seen what a major global pandemic can be. The Black Death is much more substantial than what COVID is or has been over the past 2 years. So for the Black Death, we're talking about mortality rates of something like 25-30%. So every one in 4 or even 3 people in the cities who died in the course of 2 or 3 years from 1348 to 1350 or 1351. So you can only imagine what this kind of mortality can do to a society. So there are the immediate implications. You lose a quarter of administrators, a quarter of the teachers, a quarter of the workers, a quarter of everyone in the society. And there are also the psychological effects, which you can imagine are tremendous. So you can learn a lot about society by looking at these things. And the issue of all poisoning accusations, there is a lot of writing about the Black Death, and was when I was an MA student in Jerusalem, I think 13 or 14 years ago, I started looking at the Black Death, and I was looking for the common explanation, the big book that will explain well poisoning accusations, because they're mentioning pretty much any book about the Black Death, but none of the books, none of the secondary sources actually look deep into the accusations and try to explain how they came to be. Would find something like a general line, like the Jews were scapegoated, or people who were so terrified by the plague that they would turn against the weak links of society or the minorities, and that would be about it. And I thought there must be more. And I was looking for the big book that will explain that, and it wasn't on the shelf, or it wasn't anywhere. So I always had at the back of my mind that I need to do that. But even as an MA student, I understood that it's going to be a huge project that will require a lot of skills, language skills, paleography, all kinds of skills that I still didn't have. So I kept that on the back burner and waited until I was a PhD student. And it took me several years to actually build the skills that I needed to pursue this subject.
Okay, so let's actually take a step back. Let's give, for the listeners maybe who are not familiar, some maybe somewhat familiar, some just are familiar with the Black Death, the plague, when it took place, and the causes of it and the ramifications. Before we get more into the accusations in the book, I think we should tell the listeners a little bit about that.
So the Black Death is an outbreak of a disease that is called the bubonic plague. It's actually a disease that is common for rodents. You can still find it all over the world in rodents, and it usually stays in rodents. In some conditions, it can transfer from rodents, from marmots, rats, animals like that, to people through a vector, sometimes a flea or something like that, would transfer blood from the rodent to a person, and that is when the person can be sick. And this is a very, very serious disease. Not so much today, because it can be treated with antibiotics, and today can be contained fairly easily. So you won't see a major outbreak. But when we are talking about the Middle Ages, they don't have anything like that. They know how to quarantine cities or settlements to stop disease from spreading, but it doesn't work for the Black Death, because they're stopping people from moving to from one place to another. They're not stopping rodents. Rats are still moving around, and they're still spreading the disease. So they're trying to use quarantines, but this doesn't work, and they don't have anything else that they can apply to stop the plague. So the plague reached Europe in 1348, first to Italy, and then it spread gradually to the north and to the east. And as I said, the mortality rates in cities ranged between 20 and 40%, usually, as much as we can understand. And the thing about the plague is that it went away. In each city, after it spread, it took about 3 or 4 months before it started to die down. But then it returned after about a decade. So European cities continued to experience episodes of the plague every 7 to 12 years, all the way into the 17th century. So the Black Death is not only a story of the mid-14th century, it's something that remains part of European history for 300 years or so.
Okay, so now your book picks up on the accusations. So now I think we should start with the accusations. There were accusations against minorities. Obviously, this time they didn't, as you indicated, they didn't understand the cause. They just knew to quarantine. They didn't understand where it was coming from. So what were who made these accusations, and what were these accusations?
Okay, so the first thing we have to know about well poisoning accusations is that they didn't start with the Black Death. The idea is that a minority group, often Jews, but not necessarily, as we'll soon see, would poison water sources, wells, fountains, water holes that are used by the general public, and then everyone will get either sick or will die. And then the next stage is a political coup, or the minority group will take over the government. So that's the idea. That's the conspiracy theory, and it made a lot of sense for many historians that it appear with the Black Death, because you have a major social crisis. As I said, people are dying left and right. It's really scary. Many of the officials die. So in this stage of political instability and social instability, it's not surprising to see strange accusations and violence and persecution of minorities. It all makes sense, other than the fact that when you look at the documents, you see that well poisoning accusations began 27 years before the Black Death in 1321. And they started as a fairly local affair in southwestern France and a little bit in Aragon, which is northern France of northern Spain of today. And they were first not aimed against Jews. For the first 2 or 3 months, the minority group that was targeted was lepers, and only lepers. For 2 or 3 months, there were well poisoning accusations. Lepers were accused of poisoning wells, were put on trial, executed, their property confiscated, and no Jews were involved. They were not accused, they were not persecuted. Nothing happened. And suddenly, after 3 months, there was some kind of a shift, and Jews were suddenly brought into the narrative of the accusations and started to be persecuted, or the nobility of Central France started to persecute them, I should say. So first of all, well poisoning accusations didn't start with the Black Death, and second, they didn't start with Jews. They started with lepers.
Okay, so 2 follow-up questions on that. First of all, can you just define a leper for the listeners?
So the official definition of a leper is someone who has Hansen's disease. It's a skin disease, but it can affect the nerves, and therefore it can create all kinds of other complications. But this is not necessary. It's not necessarily means that everyone who was defined as a leper in the Middle Ages had the Hansen's disease. They had their own ways of diagnosing, and they're probably caught a lot of other skin diseases or all kinds of conditions that we would define otherwise today as leprosy. And the thing about leprosy is that what is important for us to understand the accusations is that it's not necessarily the clinical problem that drives the persecution or drives the accusations against lepers. It's the fact that lepers are being marginalized more and more outside of medieval society. They're pushed further out of the cities. They are closed more and more in their leper houses, and they're allowed less and less freedom. They're allowed to come into the cities less often. They are not allowed to come to the market. They are not allowed to use the same water sources. And we see this kind of phenomenon in southwestern France before 1321, before well poisoning accusations begin. So we see the lepers being pushed out of society, and then in 1321 we see the accusations against them that they are trying to poison society. So what you have is a minority that is defined by the possibility that they are infectious, that they have an infectious disease, and that they can poison society or infect society by accident. And at some point, the idea that this can happen by accident becomes an accusation that they would poison society on purpose. And this is what happens in 1321. But if we want to understand that, and this is one of the things that the book is doing, we have to look before that for the causes.
Yeah, so one more question though on this. Was there a specific instance that led to these accusations in 1321 that we know of?
Yes. So one of the things that we see in 1321, or even before 1321, city councils and local nobles of southwestern France are trying to take control of the leper houses. They're trying to take control of the countryside in general, and leper houses are one of the institutions or one of the places that they're trying to control. The thing about leper houses is that they usually have some kind of privilege. They have either have a patron or they are under the authority of the local bishop. There are all kinds of arrangements, but they are not under the city council or the local noble. They have some kind of autonomy. And this autonomy is also an economic autonomy. These leper houses have real estate, they have fields, they have vineyards, sometimes they have other sources of income. Lepers are receiving alms or contributions. And the leper houses have some kind of property that is worth some money. And the city councils are officially asking the King of France to let them control these leper houses, and the king pretty much ignores them. And after he does that, suddenly we see well poisoning accusations and trials and confiscation of this property as part of the war against well poisoning accusation, allegedly. So there is some kind of political and economic interest to blame the lepers and persecute them. And this is what creates the accusation. So you have the imagery of lepers as people who are dangerous because they are infectious, or that's what they thought in the Middle Ages. And then you have a political interest. And when these two are combined in 1321, then you have the actual trigger for the persecution. So political interest without a narrative, without a story, doesn't necessarily lead to persecution. And a story without political interest, without actors who are willing to act on it, is not going to produce a persecution. But when you have both, then there is potential for violence.
Now, a question that underlies the whole book title is "Poisoned Wells" is, so why were these accusations against well poisoning? What were these well poisoning specific accusations, and why did they decide? Like you're saying, these two things converged, but why on well poisoning specifically?
Because the story of well poisoning, for two reasons. First, the story of well poisoning, or the story of poisoning society, is something that fits well with the image of lepers as people who might infect society accidentally. You only need to add a little detail. They didn't drink from the public water hole because they forgot, or because there was some kind of an accident. They did it on purpose. So the stories are not that different. But we also have to understand that in many of the European cities of the 14th century, the phenomenon of public wells or public water sources is fairly new. In the 13th century, in many of the European cities, they start building public water systems. It means that people are starting to rely for their water supply on a well that is also being used by their neighbors, or anyone who passed through the street can use the well. Before that, in the 12th century and before then, most people would rely on wells or water holes that were actually in their backyard, or that they had better control over. Once cities are trying to manage water supply and maintain these public systems, then people are becoming reliant on the public system, and they have less control over where their water is coming from and what condition, what quality of water they are receiving. And we can imagine that this can be very, very scary.
Now, how do these accusations, like you said, this is before the Black Death. The Black Death hits 20-something years later. How did these accusations suddenly, first of all, go to the Black Death? And I guess the second part of the question, because it's kind of together, I can't really split the question, is how do they spread across Europe from South France, North Spain? It doesn't only, they spread everywhere.
So the initial wave of well poisoning accusations is its center is in southwestern France, around the city of Toulouse. And the border, it's not very far from the border to Aragon. It's across the Pyrenees, the Pyrenees Mountains. It's not very far geographically, and we know that people are going back and forth very often at this period. It's not a big deal to get from southern France to Catalonia or to Aragon. But what happens is that lepers are being persecuted in this area. And after a few months, a group of nobles from central France actually uses the fact that the idea of well poisoning already was accepted to Cruz, was accepted by court and by the king himself, and they use it to create political leverage to expel the Jews from France. So, and then the accusation is first turned against Jews, and they are being incorporated into the narrative of the conspiracy. And after that happens, the Jews are being expelled from France. We're not sure that there was an official expulsion, but whoever was there decided that it's a good idea to run or to run away. And after 1321, there aren't any, or there are very, very few Jews in France, if any at all. And then the accusations died out because many of the lepers were executed or enclosed in their houses, and the Jews were expelled. So the minorities that were accused are either no longer there or are very weak and have no political power and lost most of their property. So the accusations basically disappear. And they disappear for 27 years. We don't have, between 1321 and 1348, I couldn't find any real accusation of well poisoning. And I think if it didn't happen that the Black Death suddenly arrived in Europe in 1348, that would be the case. There wouldn't be other episodes of well poisoning accusations, and this idea wouldn't spread across Europe, as you said. But when the Black Death arrived and it was devastating, it didn't look like anything else. It really created social distress in a level that the people of the Middle Ages didn't know, and we don't know. It was really a horrible, horrible time to live. And then the idea of well poisoning suddenly made sense. Suddenly, it looked like everyone were poisoned. It suddenly looked like everyone were dying for no apparent reason. It didn't look like anything that people knew. And then the idea of well poisoning made sense, and then it came back to life. And it came back to life in the same places that it was common in 1321, in southern France, and a little bit in Provence, and a little bit in Aragon. But the same places that had well poisoning accusation in 1321, suddenly 27 years later, with the Black Death, these accusations came back to life. People suddenly remembered. Some of the people may have been alive or even involved in the accusation 27 years later, and they remembered the story. And the story suddenly made sense. And then the accusations returned, and they spread across Europe. And the reason that they spread is that they are being formalized in trials. So in order to accusation to be convincing, it needs to have evidence. People in the Middle Ages were not necessarily unsophisticated about verifying what they thought was important, especially politically important. So they would conduct trials and gather evidence and transfer information from one official to another. And this is what happens because once well poisoning accusations are becoming somewhat official and produce records, trial records and confessions of suspects, these documents can be transferred from one city to the next. And this is the mechanism that actually drives the persecution further. So we should remember that it's not necessarily, or there is some kind of a popular element, but it's not the major thing. It's not mobs or terrified people that are taking their swords or axes or whatever and attack the Jews or attack other minorities. Mostly we're talking about organized trials, decision of city councils or rulers who decide to act against minorities or to execute the Jews. So what is important and what was important to me when I wrote the book is to follow the decision-making process of these actors, the local rulers, the city councils, the nobles. How do they decide that they believe well-poisoning accusations or that they want to act on well-poisoning accusations? And when exactly does this happen? What kind of information they need to receive? And in what kind of political situation they might decide to act?
So can you talk a little bit more about that, about those things, about how they act on it and what kind of information they use and the various, city rulers and other things?
Yeah. So, of course, the most famous cases of persecution that is related to well-poisoning accusations come from the German Empire, because that's where the major Jewish communities were, and that's where most of the Jews were persecuted, and that's really the place that well-poisoning accusations had the most devastating effect. And that is true on the one hand. On the other hand, it's important to remember several things, that different cities had different political dynamics. So many of the cities don't need much convincing to persecute the Jews. They hear about the accusations, they receive a little bit of information, and they act. But in other cities, it takes months of gathering information before this happens. And in some cities, local rulers never turn against the Jews. In the city of Regensburg, for example, the Jews remained safe throughout the Black Death, even though they know about the accusations. Cities around them in Bavaria are persecuting their Jews, and they are not, because they were able to create a political constellation that defended the Jews. In Strasbourg, which is one of the focuses of this book, what we see is that the local council took a position of defending the Jews, and their opposition took the position that well-poisoned accusations were correct, and the Jews have to be expelled or executed. And for 6 months, the council held its own, even though they receive all kinds of information that they should believe the accusations, and they don't, and they keep protecting the Jews. But there is popular acceptance of the accusations, and in the end, the opposition uses the accusation to trigger a coup, to trigger a political shift of the government, and then they execute the Jews. So what you would often see is that the accusations, they spread everywhere, but the cities that acted on them, or the governments that decided to act on them, had some kind of political or economic reason that drove them to do that. And in many of the German cities that were not necessarily very politically stable at the time, this kind of story, this kind of trigger, that was also connected, of course, to the fear of the plague, was enough to turn the political tables against the Jews. And this is what we see in the cities that we can gather enough information to analyze these kind of processes.
So do we have what kind of documents, what kind of proofs did they use? Did they bring testimony against the Jews? And was it, credible, like you're saying, or was it mainly just hatred of Jews, anti-Semitism? They decided to believe, these accusations.
So the main kind of evidence that they bring are court records. So people who were convicted of well-poisoning accusations, who confessed to well-poisoning accusations, and people confessed because in many of the trials, torture was used. So people would confess to avoid torture, or they were manipulated because their neighbor or family member already confessed, and it was easier to force them to corroborate his or her story. So there is a lot of manipulation, there is torture, there is fear that is being applied to get these confessions. But after the people confess, then these confessions are being translated often translated into Latin, made official and put on paper and distributed to other officials, to other towns. And sometimes even cities ask for this kind of evidence. You would find a letter from one official to the other saying, we heard about the Jews, or we heard about well poisoning, the rumor about well poisoning, but we don't know. We don't know what's going on. Do you know anything? And then the city that has already decided to execute their Jews would send the evidence to the next town. So what I have is this court. I often have these trial records, and even more often I have the letters going on from one or being sent from one official to the other, and these survive in archives, or many of them, enough of them survive in archives for me to follow the spread of the accusations and the kind of information that different officials had when they made their decisions.
Right. Now, obviously, there are many specific places and instances, different things that you discuss in the book, which, we'll mainly leave to the book, unless any other ones that you want to bring up specifically. But something that we didn't touch on, we should really, especially pulling back a little bit to 1321, but still staying here where we are in 1348. You mentioned how it was the lepers and how there was this convergence of the leprosy and, the political, climate. But with the Jews, how did those accusations transfer to the Jews? And how did they in 1348 as well? Why were they suddenly accusing Jews with these well-poisoning accusations?
So for many years, historians would think of minorities together. And this is a contribution of Robert Ian Moore, who wrote in 1987 his famous book on persecuting society. And his take on the persecution of minorities in the Middle Ages was that in order to understand it, you cannot look at each minority separately, because the mechanisms that trigger the persecution come from above, come from the ruling elites. And these ruling elites look at different minorities and apply the same kind of imagery or the same kind of political mechanisms against each one of these minorities. So if you look at heretics or lepers or Jews, you would see the same language being used and the same political mechanisms being used against these different minorities. And to a large extent, he's right. But when it comes to a specific accusation, like well poisoning accusation, one of the things that I claim, and I try to show in the book, that it doesn't just transfer. It's not that you have an accusation against the lepers and it transfers to Jews because people don't like them. You have to have a narrative to justify that, especially because we said that the mechanisms of persecution are official mechanisms. Courts, city councils, they need to show that they act according to the law. These are legal mechanisms. And for legal mechanisms to work, they need to justify their action with the right story. So the story has to evolve to include Jews. And the original story of well poisoning accusation in 1321, the conspiracy of the lepers, the people who initiated the conspiracy of the lepers according to this fake story are, sorry. Okay, so the people who initiate, okay. So the original story includes the Muslims of either the Kingdom of Granada in southern Spain, or even Muslims, theoretical Muslims across the sea, Muslims that no one actually knows, as the people who orchestrated the conspiracy, who paid the lepers, who provided the poison, and so on. And from a medieval point of view, it makes sense because Muslims are the quintessential enemies of Christianity. Of course, we think about the Jews in this role, but this is a period that crusades are still being organized, and the enmity between Christianity and the Muslim world is still very much a reality. So the Muslims and the lepers conspire together according to this story, and this story makes sense. It doesn't need the Jews in this story. But when the nobility of Central France decide to incriminate the Jews for the same crime, they portray the story with the Jews as some kind as kind of a middleman between the Muslims of Spain and the lepers. This is not a necessary part of the story. The story worked well without this middleman, but they needed to involve the Jews somehow so they can get courts and rulers to act against them. And this happens already in 1321. So already you have, as part of the narrative of well-poisoned accusation, Jews. But even in 1348, the accusations originally start with marginalized Christians. So beggars, travelers, people that are unknown are first blamed for well-poisoned accusations. And only when the accusations reached an area that is southern Switzerland of today, around this area, of course, the borders in the Middle Ages are very different. This is called the area of the Dauphiné. Then the accusations against marginalized Christians are tied to Jews. There is a political interest there. This is an area that didn't have Jews until the early 14th century. And after the Jews are being expelled from France, many arrive to this area, and the local ruler doesn't really want them there, and neither does the local nobility. But the Jews are able to avoid being expelled in all kinds of ways. They bribe the ruler. They wait a little bit, and things just go back to normal. And it works until 1348. And when the plague arrives and well-poisoned accusations start or arrive to Provence, which is south of the Dauphiné, then suddenly you have the perfect storm. You have more political pressure to expel the Jews, and you have the perfect excuse with well-poisoned accusations. And this is the place where the accusations in 1348 transfer from marginalized Christian to Jews, even though you still find Christian being accused of conspiring with the Jews all the way from 1348 into the 15th century. The accusations, even when Jews are the main victim the main victims in 1348, Christians are still being occasionally accused of well-poisoned accusations. It never become a solely Jewish, anti-Jewish accusation. Right to the end. We remember it as anti-Jewish accusations, and we are right to do so because most of the victims were Jews. But the story was never only an anti-Jewish story. It was used against Christians as well.
It wasn't just merely hatred of Jews, and there was like this popular legend, myth that Jews died less in the Black Death, and that's why they decided to accuse the Jews. Was it just like you're saying, was just a political, combined with other things, the Jews were the minority, that they went after the Jews?
Yeah, so the story that the Jews die less is a story that begins in the early modern period. So we have the first traces of it in the first half of the 16th century. So long after the accusation, the actual persecution related to well-poisoned accusation already die out. If we look at Jewish communities in 1348, or when the Black Death first hit Europe, we see that they suffered at least as much as Christians did, and even more because most of the Jews in the 14th century were urban. They lived in cities. Cities are denser. They're more connected to other places. They sit on trade routes. So the plague arrived there more quickly, and the mortality rate is usually higher than in the countryside. So not only did the Jews were not immune to the plague, they probably died more because they were in the centers of infection.
Oh, so one more general question just about the accusations. So after going through all the evidence and looking at all the court records, I mean, would they? So was this generally like just to draw a general comparison, like the blood libel? Was it just a made up something to persecute minorities, to persecute Jews?
I think these accusations are very different than blood libels or host desecration accusations, which are the three major accusations of the Middle Ages against Jews, because blood libels and host desecration accusations have very strong anti-Jewish symbolic motif in them, and several historians pointed that out. Gavin Langmuir and Mir Rubin, they looked at the story at the basis of these accusations, and you have the narrative portrays an attack by the Jews against something or someone that symbolizes Christ. So with blood libels, you have a child who's innocent, and like Christ was innocent. And in many cases, you have abuse of this child, or even crucifixion of this child as a ritual act. So you have a story of the reenactment of the crucifixion. So you have very strong symbolic um, play, or the Jews are being cast in the role of the villain in this very, very old story. The same thing happened with host desecration accusation. The host, the consecrated host, signifies, or I shouldn't say represent because it's theologically incorrect. It is actually the body of Christ in Christian theology. So attacking the host is like attacking Christ, like the Jews allegedly, or according to the Christian narrative, did in the past. So you have two accusations that have a very, very strong symbolic narrative, which is an anti-Jewish narrative, and that's why Jews are being persecuted in this context, because they are the same, or they act like their ancestors who crucified Christ. So that's the basic story at the basis of these accusations. This is not true for well poisoning accusations. You don't have anything that represent Christ or Christian divinity in any way. This is an attack against the public. And the reason that you don't have this kind of symbolism is that, as I said, these accusations were created with lepers in mind. So the story is about the lepers who are a danger of who pose a danger for infection for the whole society. But this is not a classic anti-Jewish imagery. So well poisoning accusations are not remembered in the same way. They don't represent a classic anti-Jewish symbolism. And this is one of the reasons that they don't survive after the 15th century. What happens with blood libels and with host desecration accusations is that they are being remembered through mechanisms of commemoration, of medieval commemoration. So if you have blood libel or you have host desecration in a certain place, then the desecrated host become a relic, or the body of the child who was allegedly killed becomes the body of a saint. And you would get a church and maybe even a painting or a poem commemorating this event. And you would have a saint day, and pilgrims would come to the church and leave presents, and so on and so forth. And you have a mechanism of memory that preserves the original accusation and present it to future generations. Well poisoning accusation doesn't have anything like that. There are no well poisoning saints. There are no well poisoning churches. Wells that were allegedly being poisoned do not become holy places. So you don't have all these mechanisms of memory, which are so important in medieval society. So these accusations do not last, even though if you look only at the Middle Ages, they created much more devastation to Jewish communities than blood libels and even host desecration accusations. They created much more persecution in the 14th century, but they are not remembered for later generations.
Okay, so we'll get to more of what happened after you alluded to, but just to ask you, you mentioned Strasbourg and other places. I know you also Regensburg. I know Cologne was
Mm-hmm.
was another one that you discussed. I don't know if you want to discuss any specifically and why maybe in some places in Cologne and then in Regensburg maybe it differed from places in France. Why things were different and what happened in some of these locations.
So what when we think about Germany in the Middle Ages, we need to think about people call it the Holy Roman Empire or the German Empire. It's not really one empire. It's a conglomerate of bishoprics, independent cities, local rulers, all kinds of political constellations. And the Jews play a different political role in these different cities, in these different constellations. So in some places, the Jews are very important. They are very rich. They have a lot of political power. In other places, not so much. In some places, the Jews have a long connection with the local government and they enjoy protection. In other places, not so much. In some places, the Jews are perceived as a symbol of corruption, of usury, all kinds of these things. In other places, not so much. And of course, the dynamic of well poison accusation and the way it and the persecution of Jews is influenced by these things. So in Regensburg, for example, you have a tradition of the local nobility coming together to make decisions, and then the city ratifies this decision, and every one of the local nobles sign his or put his seal or sign his name on this decision. And they created a mechanism to get the local nobility behind major decisions. And they do that when they decide to protect the Jews. And it works. It works well enough for local nobility to stand behind the Jews. And you don't have this major political divide like in Strasbourg. But I have to say that in most cities, there is a lot of political instability and there is not a strong coalition that supports the Jews, and eventually they're being persecuted. And some cities are not even interested. In some cities, the local government is just looking for an excuse to turn against them. And this is more often the case. So Regensburg and Cologne, they are the exceptions, they are the outliers, but they teaches us that this process is not necessary. It has to do, even though in most communities Jews were persecuted, executed, expelled, their property confiscated, it wasn't necessary. It had to do with specific political constellations.
So after these accusations, like you're saying, in many cities, so what are the ramifications? I mean, what happens? First of all, were there pogroms, or was it like you were saying? It was kind of the ruling class, the political, rulers, the city rulers decided to, execute the Jews or expel them.
So in most of the places that we know, there was either an organized execution or an expulsion. So political action by government more than pogroms in the classical sense that we think of them. And the effect was severe. I would say it transformed the existence of Jews in the German Empire. Deborah Kaplan wrote a wonderful book about Strasbourg and what happened to the Jewish community of Strasbourg after it's expelled. And one of the things that she shows is that the Jews are being expelled and they are not allowed in Strasbourg. They're allowed for a short period and then they are expelled completely. And they reorganize themselves in rural communities, very small communities of one or two families in each little village. And they don't have this urban center. I mentioned earlier that Jews in Western Europe, especially in Germany, were very urban. They were organized in these around these major urban centers that everyone who knows Jewish history of the Middle Ages heard about: Mainz, Worms, Speyer, these major centers. And what happens after the Black Death is that almost all of these centers are either being completely destroyed or the community has to be recreated because so many people die. And often case that even when the community revives itself after the Black Death, it organizes itself in a different location, and sometimes they change communal administration. So the basic social patterns of Jewish settlement and Jewish institutions changed in the second half of the 14th century. So this was a major blow to German Jewish communities. And when we look at the 14th, 15th centuries, then what we see is a period of reorganization and shift in almost every aspect of Jewish life. In the places that rabbis are, in the way that communities communicate with each other or organize for political causes. Everything changes, basically.
Do we have any numbers? Do we know how many Jews were killed because of these accusations?
I do not have exact numbers. We don't have exact numbers for almost anything in the Middle Ages. I can give a sense. So the major communities of the Middle Ages can number 1,000 to 1,500 people, and almost all of them were destroyed in Germany. I mentioned Regensburg as one community that survived, but most of them don't. And we know of somewhere between 200 and 300 communities that were persecuted during the Black Death. So it doesn't mean that if a community was persecuted, then all of its people were executed. But we are talking about tens of thousands, most likely.
Wow. So the last chapter in the book, obviously, like I said, there's many more incidences, and you go through all the cities, and you go through the records. We're not going through all that on the podcast over here, in the episode. But the last chapter discusses post Black Death, so after the Black Death, and how these accusations gradually, especially in the 15th century, how they subside, and maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So the accusation after the first outbreak of the Black Death, they do not disappear immediately, but they appear less and less in the second half of the 14th century, and until 1420 or something like that, they're pretty much gone. And I mentioned that they don't have this symbolic aspect or mechanisms of memory that preserve them, but they also lose a lot of their political power. And one of the reasons that they lose their political power is that the attempt to stop the plague by killing the alleged poisoners doesn't work. Cities that execute their Jews or other minorities, marginalized Christians, Jewish converts, they don't escape the plague. The plague returns. As I said, the plague returns every decade or so in European cities. And over time, they just see that the plague returns again and again, whether you have Jews or in your city or not. So the accusations lose credibility. So they don't have a symbolic justification. They lose a lot of their political justification, and they died out. But they didn't disappear completely because they were remembered as stories, as anti-Jewish images, as part of legends or chronicles. But they were not an active justification for persecution of Jews after 1422, let's say.
Okay, and then I guess the last question I will ask you is, what can the study of Wells poisoning accusations tell us about Jewish history, and especially in the period?
I think it tells us a lot about the challenges that Jews faced. Unfortunately, this is not a classic book of Jewish history. I have several Jewish sources that I try to use I try to use every bit of information that they gave me. But the major sources of this book are court records, official correspondence, chronicles, Christian documents or Latin or vernacular documents, because the Jews were the victims of these accusations. But if I want to explain them, I need to look at the people who created them, pushed them, promoted them, spread the narrative, and so on and so forth. These were not the Jews. However, what is, I think, essential for Jewish history is first the challenge that Jews faced. As I said, they had to reorganize their communities. They had to recreate their institutions. So this is a major shift in Jewish history in Europe in the 14th century. And another thing is that this is the period that we see the persecution of minorities and Jews in particular becoming more and more institutionalized. If you look, for example, at blood libels in the 12th century and blood libels in the 15th century, they look very different. In the 15th century, you would see courts involved. You would see a lot of official investigation and political action and documents surrounding the accusations. It's not a legend anymore. It's a secular court case, even though it contains anti-Jewish imagery or contains Christian ideas. The whole discussion is an institutional discussion. This is, I think, is a turning point that happens in the 14th century, and the institutional approach towards Jews, whether it's persecution or whether it's protection of Jews, you see these institutions highly involved from the second half of the 14th century into the 15th, 16th centuries, and I imagine after that also, but this is not my expertise, my field of expertise anymore.
Okay, and I would ask you, I know this book is new. This obviously research took you a long time. Are there any, you still any future projects? Are you focusing on the same time period or no?
Yes, I have a few things that I've already wrote and a few things that are in different stages of research. So my next project is focusing on rituals related to water and Jewish and Christian societies. So I'm trying to look at rituals, or especially lay rituals, informal rituals, and see how these developed in Jewish society and Christian society, and see whether the fact that they are related to water changes or is the basis of common themes between Jewish and Christian rituals. So water, but from a different angle, not so much institutions and politics, more images and rituals. And another project that I just started working on relate to river and river travel in medieval Europe, and also there Jews are playing a very important role. And I'm trying to follow Jews who use Jews or other people who use river travel. They travel over rivers by boats and ships, and I try to understand how the geographical layout of rivers actually shapes ways of communication and transfer of information and people and goods between communities or between urban centers. So water in all kinds of ways. There is still a lot to do and many interesting things to explore.
Okay, very interesting. And for listeners, I will put a link in the show's notes where they can purchase the book. And thank you very much for joining me to discuss it.
Thank you for the opportunity. Have a good evening.